You just heard the verdict coming from Worcester Superior Court Judge Janet Kenton Walker in the trial against David Njuguna, the man found now guilty of being responsible of a crash that killed State Trooper Thomas Clardy. You see his wife there, his widow, leaving with their 7 children. We understand that there's a large contingent of state troopers at the courthouse right now, about 75 of them in a show of support. They're also in the courtroom. And joining me is Chief Investigator Cheryl Fiandaca to break this down for us, break down the charges. He was found guilty of a number of them, but the judge talked about the Commonwealth not proving that he was actually high on marijuana, but proving that he was reckless.
Right, and so that's why she found him guilty on the charges of manslaughter. Basically what she's saying, and this is a case that's really been sort of interesting because there is really no test for marijuana. We have the breathalyzer test where we can determine whether or not someone is operating under the influence, but there's no real test that's able to determine whether or not someone is under the influence of marijuana. And I think she made that clear. She basically said, you know, she had no testimony of any expert that would be able to testify what that standard is. There's no standard that says at this level you're under the influence and at this level you're not. So that's what she found in this case, and I think that everyone was watching this case for that reason, and obviously the fact that this is a Massachusetts state trooper that was killed. But she said that he was driving recklessly, that he passed many vehicles on the road, that he was swerving in and out of traffic. She said that this was not an accident, that this was a crime, and she revoked his bail at the end. So he's being held now for sentencing.
She also talked about the fact that he was a medical marijuana patient. So he did have levels of THC in his body that may have been inactive for days, and his blood did test positive for THC. There was surveillance that caught him buying marijuana cigarettes ahead of the crash. She found him guilty of misdemeanor motor vehicle homicide, guilty of involuntary manslaughter, guilty of operating an uninsured vehicle, guilty of operating to endanger, but not guilty of felony motor vehicle homicide, and also not guilty of manslaughter while under the influence.
Right. And so, I mean, basically what she was saying is that his conduct was reckless, that he was driving erratically, that he was driving too fast, that he was weaving in and out of traffic, and that reckless behavior was basically, she said it was reckless and wanton and negligent. It was all of those things. So it's everything that you could be without finding someone under the influence of drugs or alcohol. And in this case, she said that she credited all the testimony of all of the expert witnesses who said that they had accident reconstructionists take a look at the scene. But she said that despite the fact that he did purchase marijuana and they were able to show that, there was no evidence that he actually used it prior to the crash. Because as you said, the levels in his system, there's no test that says this level you're operating under the influence and at this level you're not. So she's unable to determine that based on what the case law is.
So it took 2 weeks for her to find a verdict. Njuguna waived his right to a jury trial.
Right.
So he had a bench trial instead. And also he didn't testify on his own behalf. We saw during the closing arguments that there was an outburst in the courtroom because he started criticizing his attorney, saying that he wasn't counseled correctly. What does that mean? Does that somehow influence the judge's decision?
It doesn't influence the judge's decision. It could influence whatever happens on appeal, because obviously he'll appeal this conviction because he's now been found guilty and he'll be sentenced. So he could go forward saying that he had basically what's called ineffective assistance of counsel, which means that I don't think my lawyer was able to assist me and do what I wanted to be done in this trial, because his outburst was that he wanted to apologize, that he wanted to speak. And his lawyers were telling him, well, first of all, it wasn't the right time for him to speak, and we're telling him that it wasn't a good idea for him to speak as a strategy. And one of the issues is, removing the lawyers or allowing them to be removed themselves, rather, at the end of the case before a verdict is decided, or a finding in this case, is kind of unusual. So that sets up a potential issue for appeal for him, for sure.
All right. Well, Cheryl Fiandaca, thank you very much for your insight.